In the long history of infantry weapons, few pieces of equipment have generated the kind of enduring loyalty and professional respect that British and Commonwealth soldiers developed for the Bren light machine gun during the Second World War. Veterans who carried it through the Western Desert, through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the jungles of Burma, and through the frozen hills of Korea, speak of the weapon in terms that go beyond professional appreciation into something closer to affection. The deep regard that soldiers develop for tools that have saved their lives repeatedly and never let them down. Yet the Bren was not, at first glance, a weapon that inspired immediate confidence. Its appearance was unconventional, even slightly absurd to eyes accustomed to conventional machine gun design. The curved magazine that fed the weapon from above rather than from below or from the side gave it a top-heavy, ungainly silhouette that seemed to violate common sense about how an automatic weapon should look and function. Early critics questioned whether the magazine position would cause problems with balance, with the gunner's ability to see his target, and with the feeding reliability of a system that relied on gravity working against it rather than with it. These critics, applying the logic of conventional weapons design to an unconventional solution, missed something fundamental about the Bren's engineering, that the qualities they questioned as potential weaknesses were in fact carefully considered design choices that would prove to be among the weapon's greatest strengths. The Bren was not ungainly. It was precise. It was not unconventional for the sake of novelty. It was unconventional because the designers had thought more carefully than most about what a light machine gun actually needed to do in the hands of infantry soldiers in the field, and had made engineering choices that prioritized the things that mattered most. This is the story of the Bren gun, of how first impressions deceived and operational experience revealed, of how a weapon that some dismissed as awkward became the most reliable and most respected light machine gun of the entire war, and of how even its enemies came to value it so highly that they used it against its original owners whenever they could. The origins of the Bren lay in Czechoslovakia rather than Britain, a fact that reflects the international nature of weapons development in the interwar period, and the British military's willingness, sometimes reluctantly expressed, to adopt foreign designs when they were demonstrably superior to domestic alternatives. The Czech Zed Beavers 26, designed at the Brno Arms factory in the 1920s, was one of the most advanced light machine guns of its era, incorporating a gas-operated mechanism with an innovative tilting bolt system that provided excellent reliability across a wide range of ammunition and environmental conditions. When Britain began searching for a replacement for the aging Lewis gun in the early 1930s, the Zibi design was among those evaluated, and it quickly distinguished itself in trials as offering superior reliability, accuracy, and ease of maintenance compared to its competitors. The adoption of the Czech design by Britain required adaptation to British military requirements and manufacturing standards, and the resulting weapon was designated the Bren, the name derived from a combination of Brno, the Czech city where the original was designed, and Enfield, the British Royal Small Arms Factory, where the adapted weapon was to be manufactured. The calibre was changed from the Czech 7.92mm to the British 303 inch, which required significant modifications to the feed system and barrel design. The curved magazine that became the Bren's most distinctive visual feature was a direct consequence of this calibre change. The British 303 cartridge had a pronounced rim and a slight taper to the case, which prevented the stacking of cartridges in a straight magazine. The curved shape was not an aesthetic choice or a designer's eccentricity, but a geometrical necessity imposed by the shape of the cartridge the weapon had to feed. Yet the top-mounted position of the magazine was a deliberate design choice that went beyond mere necessity. Placing the magazine above the receiver rather than below it had several significant implications for the weapon's operation. From below, a conventional bottom-feeding magazine would require the spring to push cartridges upward against gravity, a reliable arrangement in most conditions, but one that became less reliable when the spring was weakened by long use or when the magazine lips were damaged. From above, The Bren's magazine allowed gravity to assist the feeding of cartridges, with the weight of the rounds in the magazine contributing to the feeding force rather than opposing it. This arrangement was more tolerant of weak magazine springs, of slightly deformed magazine lips, and of the various contamination and wear conditions that magazines inevitably developed in field service. The top-mounted magazine also had implications for the gunner's prone firing position. When firing from the ground, as was standard practice for light machine gun use, the bottom clearance required for a conventional bottom-feeding magazine forced the gunner to elevate the weapon and consequently his body, increasing his profile and his vulnerability to enemy fire. The Bren's top-mounted magazine allowed the weapon to lie much lower to the ground, with the receiver and barrel almost at ground level and the magazine projecting upward rather than downward. This significantly reduced the gunner's profile in the prone position, making him a smaller and harder target for enemy fire. It also meant that the bipod on which the Bren rested could be set lower, providing a more stable firing platform in many terrain conditions. The visual impact of the top-mounted magazine was the first thing that struck observers encountering the Bren for the first time, and initial reactions were frequently skeptical. Soldiers trained on conventional weapons found the magazine's position counterintuitive and worried that it would obstruct the gunner's sightline to the target. This concern was addressed in the Bren's design through the placement of the rear sight on top of the magazine housing, positioned so that the gunner could see over the magazine to the target. The forward sight was mounted on the barrel ahead of the magazine, and the alignment of front and rear sights was arranged so that the magazine was below the line of sight rather than interrupting it. In practice, trained Bren gunners found that the magazine's position created less difficulty with sighting than critics had predicted, and that the weapon's low profile in the prone position more than compensated for any slight adjustment required to see past the magazine body. The mechanical heart of the Bren was its gas-operated tilting bolt system, inherited from the Czech ZB design and adapted for British production. When a cartridge was fired, propellant gas was tapped from the barrel through a small port and directed into a cylinder beneath the barrel, where it drove a piston rearward. This piston was connected to the bolt carrier, which moved rearward, and as it did so, a camming surface caused the rear of the bolt to tilt downward, unlocking it from the receiver. The bolt carrier and bolt then moved rearward together, extracting and ejecting the spent case, compressing the return spring and cocking the firing mechanism. The return spring then drove the bolt carrier forward, stripping a fresh cartridge from the magazine, chambering it, and returning the bolt to the locked position ready for the next shot. This sequence was mechanically elegant, with relatively few moving parts and generous tolerances between components that allowed the action to continue functioning even when contaminated with dirt, sand, or other debris. The generous tolerances of the Bren's mechanism were a deliberate engineering choice that reflected the designer's understanding of field conditions. A mechanism designed to very tight tolerances would function beautifully when clean and well lubricated, but would malfunction when even small amounts of contamination entered the action. A mechanism designed with more generous clearances between components might sacrifice a fraction of theoretical mechanical efficiency, but would continue to function when grit, sand, or mud was present in the action. The Bren's designers chose the latter approach, building in the clearances that allowed the mechanism to continue operating in the conditions that infantry soldiers actually encountered, rather than the conditions that workshop engineers experienced. This choice proved to be one of the most important factors in the weapon's legendary reliability in the field. The barrel of the Bren was designed for quick removal and replacement, a feature that addressed one of the fundamental limitations of sustained automatic fire: heat. A machine gun barrel subjected to continuous fire heats rapidly. An excessive barrel temperature causes accuracy to degrade, ammunition to cook off, and eventually the barrel itself to become permanently damaged. The conventional solution, reducing the rate of fire to allow the barrel to cool, was tactically limiting. The Bren solution was a quick change barrel system that allowed a trained crew to replace a hot barrel with a cool spare in approximately 6 seconds. The barrel was secured by a catch at the front of the receiver that could be released with one hand, allowing the barrel to be swung upward and forward out of its seat. A spare barrel, carried in an insulated carrier as part of the gun crew's equipment, could then be inserted and locked into position in a similarly rapid operation. A brief tug on the cocking handle confirmed that the new barrel was correctly seated, and the weapon was ready to resume firing. The practical implications of this barrel change capability were significant for sustained operations. A Bren gun team operating in defence could maintain fire for extended periods without the barrel overheating, by alternating between 2 or 3 barrels as each heated to the point requiring replacement. In attack, the ability to replace a barrel that had been overheated during an intensive fire mission allowed the gun to resume supporting the advance without the delay of waiting for air cooling. Enemy forces who were suppressed by Bren fire and who attempted to exploit a pause in firing to advance found that the pause lasted only the seconds required for a barrel change, rather than the minutes required for an unequipped weapon to cool sufficiently for accurate fire to resume. The rate of fire of the Bren was deliberately set lower than many comparable weapons, at approximately 500 rounds per minute compared to the German MG-34's 900 rounds per minute, or the MG-42's approximately 1200 rounds per minute. This lower rate of fire was not an accident or a limitation, but a deliberate design choice based on a specific philosophy of light machine gun employment. The British tactical doctrine held that the light machine gun's primary value lay in accurate, controllable fire that could be directed precisely at specific targets rather than in the indiscriminate saturation of an area with the maximum possible volume of fire. A lower rate of fire gave the gunner better control of each burst, allowed him to direct fire more precisely, and extended the time before barrel overheating required a change. It also made the Bren's 28-round magazine last longer, reducing the frequency of magazine changes that required the gunner to break his firing position. The Bren's accuracy was exceptional for a light machine gun and became one of its most celebrated characteristics. The combination of the tilting bolt's positive locking, the well-designed barrel with its carefully dimensioned rifling, and the bipod's provision of a stable firing platform gave the Bren a level of single-shot accuracy that many semi-automatic rifles would have been proud to match. At ranges up to 500 yards, a skilled Bren gunner could deliver precise bursts onto specific targets with consistency that was remarkable for an automatic weapon. This accuracy was not merely a feature of calm range conditions, but was maintained in field environments, reflecting both the weapon's inherent precision and the quality of the manufacturing processes at Enfield and at the Canadian factories that produced the weapon during the war. The Bren's performance in the specific environmental conditions of the Second World War's various theatres provides the most compelling evidence of its exceptional reliability. In the western desert of North Africa, where fine, penetrating sand found its way into every mechanical device regardless of protective measures, the Bren demonstrated a tolerance for contamination that other weapons could not match. German weapons, including the otherwise highly regarded MG-34 and MG-42, were significantly more sensitive to the desert sand that infiltrated their more precisely toleranced actions, and German units operating in North Africa experienced higher rates of weapon malfunction than their British counterparts. The Bren's generous tolerances allowed it to continue functioning in sand conditions that disabled competing designs, giving British infantry fire teams a significant advantage in the desert fighting that characterised the North African campaign. In Italy, where the terrain alternated between baking dust in summer and clinging mud in autumn and winter, the Bren again proved more tolerant of environmental contamination than most alternatives. The mud of the Italian campaign was particularly destructive to mechanical devices, packing into actions and preventing the movement of components. Soldiers described the Italian mud as almost alive in its ability to penetrate and disable equipment, and weapons maintenance under these conditions was a constant and losing battle for most units. The Bren, while not immune to the Italian mud, was more resilient than most, capable of continuing to function after exposure to mud that would have disabled weapons with tighter tolerances or more complex mechanisms. The Burma campaign subjected the Bren to the most extreme environmental conditions of any theatre in which British forces operated. The combination of intense heat, extreme humidity, torrential monsoon rain, thick jungle mud, and the biological contamination of an environment teeming with organisms that corroded metal and degraded lubricants created conditions that were devastating to precision mechanical instruments. The Bren's track record in Burma was remarkable. Units that had given up on maintaining other weapons to anything approaching factory specification found that the Bren continued to function with minimal maintenance, its forgiving tolerances absorbing the environmental insults that disabled more precisely engineered alternatives. Veterans of the Burma campaign consistently identify the Bren's reliability in these conditions as one of the defining memories of their service, a weapon that could be relied upon absolutely even when everything else seemed to be breaking down. The encounter between German forces and the Bren gun produced one of the most striking testimonials to the weapon's quality. The systematic German practice of capturing Bren guns and using them against their original owners. This practice was common enough to be documented in multiple theatre and unit histories, and it reflected a deliberate assessment by German soldiers and commanders that the captured Bren was worth the logistical complication of using a weapon that fired British .303 ammunition rather than the standard German 7.92mm cartridge. German forces that captured Bren guns in North Africa, in Italy, and in northwest Europe routinely pressed them into service, issuing the captured British ammunition alongside the weapons or prioritising the capture of British ammunition supplies specifically to sustain the use of captured Brens. The German appreciation for the captured Bren was grounded in direct operational experience. German soldiers who encountered the Bren as an enemy weapon, and who then had the opportunity to examine or use captured examples, recognised immediately that the weapon had qualities that their own light machine guns did not fully match. The Bren's accuracy was superior to the MG-34 and MG-42 in the light machine gun role, where precise controlled fire was more valuable than the high volume of fire that German weapons prioritised. The Bren's reliability in adverse conditions was recognised as exceptional, particularly by German soldiers who had experienced their own weapons malfunctioning in the same conditions where Bren guns continued to function, and the Bren's manageable rate of fire made it more controllable in the hands of soldiers who had not been specifically trained on the weapon, an important consideration when captured weapons were being used by personnel unfamiliar with them. German after-action reports and intelligence assessments that have been preserved in archives consistently praise the Bren's reliability and note the practice of retaining and using captured examples. One German infantry regiment operating in North Africa recorded in its war diary that captured Bren guns were being issued to platoons that had experienced high rates of malfunction with their standard MG-34s in desert conditions, and that the captured British weapons had performed more reliably than the German weapons they replaced. This specific acknowledgement, in an official military document, of the superiority of a captured enemy weapon in field conditions is a remarkable testimony to the Bren's quality, and to the objective assessment of German military professionals who encountered it. The Bren gun team, typically consisting of the gunner and a number 2 who assisted with magazine changes, target indication, and observation, developed a tactical partnership that reflected the weapon's specific operational characteristics. The number 2 carried additional magazines in a specially designed bag, could provide covering fire with a rifle, while the gunner changed magazines or barrels and assisted in selecting firing positions that exploited the Bren's accuracy and stability. The team developed intimate knowledge of each other's movements and intentions through training and operational experience, functioning as a unit with complementary capabilities rather than as 2 individuals performing separate tasks. This partnership was a fundamental element of British infantry tactics, with the Bren team providing the section's principal firepower and the riflemen of the section working in support of the Bren rather than independently. The training of Bren gunners emphasised the weapon's potential for accurate aimed fire rather than the suppressive volume fire that characterised some other machine gun doctrines. Gunners were taught to fire in short controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, maintaining the barrel on target between bursts and adjusting aim based on the fall of shot. This technique produced much better hit probability per round expended than the long burst that inexperienced gunners tended to favour, and it extended the life of the barrel and the magazine considerably. Skilled Bren gunners could engage multiple targets in succession with a single magazine, shifting fire from one target to another with the kind of precision that was simply not achievable with higher rate of fire weapons whose longer bursts tended to drag across the target rather than concentrating on it. The manufacturing history of the Bren during the war reflects both the weapon's importance to the British war effort and the industrial challenge of producing it in the quantities required. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was the primary British producer, but wartime demand quickly exceeded what Enfield could provide, and production was established at additional facilities in Britain and in Canada. The Canadian production at the John Inglis Company in Toronto was particularly significant, with Canadian-made Brens equipping both Commonwealth forces and being supplied through Lend-Lease to various Allied nations. The manufacturing quality of the Canadian Brens was consistently high, reflecting the professionalism of the Inglis workforce and the management of the production programme, and Canadian-made Brens served alongside British examples without distinction in the field. The variety of roles in which the Bren was employed beyond its primary function as a section-light machine gun reflects the weapon's versatility and the confidence that British and Commonwealth forces had developed in its reliability. Bren guns were mounted on vehicles providing mobile fire support for mechanised infantry and reconnaissance units. They were fitted with anti-aircraft sights and used in the ground-to-air role, providing some protection against low-flying aircraft to units that lacked dedicated anti-aircraft weapons. They were used in static defensive positions as sustained fire weapons, their barrel change capability allowing extended fire missions that would otherwise have required heavier crew-served weapons. In airborne operations, Bren guns were among the most valuable weapons that parachute and glider troops could bring with them, given their combination of firepower and portability, and they were prioritised in the limited weight and volume that airborne logistics allowed. The comparison between the Bren and the German MG-34 and MG-42 that it most frequently faced in combat is more nuanced than simple claims of superiority or inferiority in either direction. The German weapons, particularly the MG-42, with its extraordinary rate of fire, had genuine advantages in the suppressive fire role, where the psychological and physical effect of a high volume of fire was more important than precision. The distinctive sound of the MG-42, described by soldiers who heard it as a tearing or ripping noise rather than the rhythmic hammering of lower rate of fire weapons, had a well-documented psychological effect on troops subjected to it, and the sheer volume of fire the weapon produced could suppress defensive positions effectively. These were genuine tactical advantages in certain situations, but the German high rate of fire philosophy imposed corresponding costs that became apparent in sustained operations. The MG-42's rate of fire consumed ammunition at a rate that strained logistics, requiring much larger ammunition supplies to be carried and resupplied than the Bren demanded. Barrel changes were required more frequently, and while the MG-42 also had a quick-change barrel system, the frequency of changes in sustained fire situations imposed an operational burden greater than the Bren's. The higher rate of fire made the MG-42 more difficult to control in bursts, tending to produce longer, less precise bursts than the Bren's more manageable rate of fire facilitated. And in the adverse environmental conditions where the Bren's reliability advantages were most pronounced, the MG-42's more precisely toleranced mechanism was more susceptible to contamination-induced malfunctions. The legacy of the Bren gun extends far beyond the Second World War, in which it achieved its greatest fame. The weapon was modified after the war to accept the NATO standard 7.62mm cartridge, redesignated the L4 Bren, and continued in service with British and Commonwealth forces through the Falklands War of 1982 and beyond. This longevity, spanning 4 decades of service across multiple conflicts and major changes in military technology and doctrine, is perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the fundamental soundness of the Bren's design. Weapons that are merely adequate are replaced when something better becomes available. Weapons that are genuinely excellent are retained, modified, and adapted as long as the fundamental design remains competitive, and the Bren remained competitive for 40 years after the end of the war in which it made its name. Veterans of the Second World War who carried the Bren through the worst conditions of the conflict's various theatres speak of the weapon with a consistency that is itself striking. Across different theatres, different units, and different nationalities within the Commonwealth forces, the same qualities are identified. The reliability that allowed the weapon to function when other guns failed, the accuracy that allowed precise fire at ranges where other light machine guns could only saturate, and the balance of firepower and portability that made the weapon genuinely manageable by the 2-man teams that carried it. These veterans, who had every reason to be objective about a weapon's failings after experiencing the consequences of those failings in combat, were almost unanimously positive about the Bren in a way that conventional weapons assessments rarely captured. The Bren gun stands in the history of Second World War infantry weapons as an example of what happens when careful engineering, grounded in realistic understanding of operational conditions, produces a design that meets its requirements more fully than competing alternatives. The top-mounted curved magazine that initially attracted skepticism was a thoughtful solution to real problems of feeding reliability and gunner profile. The lower rate of fire that some critics compared unfavourably to German weapons was a deliberate choice that prioritised accuracy and control over volume. The generous tolerances that purists might have criticised as imprecision were the key to the weapon's exceptional reliability in adverse conditions. Every characteristic that was questioned proved, in the light of operational experience, to have been correctly chosen. The German soldiers who captured Bren guns and used them against their original owners were in their way, paying the highest possible compliment to British engineering. They were saying, with their actions if not their words, that this weapon, this unconventional top-magazine-fed, moderately paced light machine gun designed by Czech engineers and manufactured in Britain and Canada, was worth the logistical complexity of operating a weapon outside their standard supply system. They were saying that its qualities, the qualities that had initially struck observers as slightly odd, and that some had dismissed as limitations, were actually so valuable in the conditions of real combat that they were worth any inconvenience to obtain. In that recognition, by enemies who had every reason to prefer their own weapons, the Bren gun found its ultimate validation as one of the finest infantry weapons of the Second World War.